Yesterday, I had the privilege of attending the rolling out of a peace plan by the President of the United States regarding the Israel-Palestine conflict. And I offered you a hypothetical the other day. What if a Democratic president were to be elected and Congress were to authorize much money to either Israel or the Palestinians, and the Democratic president were to say to Israel, no, I'm going to withhold this money unless you stop all settlement growth, or to the Palestinians, I will withhold the money Congress authorized to you unless you stop paying terrorists. And the president said, quid pro quo. If you don't do it, you don't get the money. If you do it, you get the money. There's no one in this chamber that would regard that as in any way unlawful. The only thing that would make a quid pro quo unlawful is if the quo were in some way illegal. Now, we talked about motive. There are three possible motives that a political figure can have. One, a motive in the public interest, and the Israel argument would be in the public interest. The second is in his own political interest, and the third, which hasn't been mentioned, would be in his own financial interest, his own pure financial interest, just putting money in the bank. I want to focus on the second one for just one moment. Every public official that I know believes that his election is in the public interest. And mostly you're right. Your election is in the public interest. And if a president does something which he believes will help him get elected in the public interest, that cannot be the kind of quid pro quo that results in impeachment. If a hypothetical president of the United States said to a hypothetical leader of a foreign country, unless you build a hotel with my name on it, and unless you give me $1 million kickback, I will withhold the funds. That's an easy case. That's purely corrupt and in the purely private interest. But a complex middle case is, I want to be elected. I think I'm a great president. I think I'm the greatest president there ever was. And if I'm not elected, the national interest will suffer greatly. That cannot be an impeachable offense. Thank you, Mr. Chief Justice.
Now, to be clear, what Dershowitz is trying to argue here is that quid pro quos committed for re-election are perfectly legal. He's basically saying that as long as a president claims that his re-election is, quote, in the public interest, which Trump, the eternal narcissist, clearly does, then he has carte blanche to do anything he wants en route to achieving that end. He can withhold any aid, leverage any favors, and always simply argue that he needs to do so because it'll help him get reelected, and in turn, it'll help the American public to have him continue to serve as president. In other words, any cheating by the president can be chalked up to just doing what he's got to do to stay in office because, of course, it's not him who's really being helped here, it's the American people. I mean, we actually have the legal team for the President of the United States making the King Louis XIV argument right now, that Trump is good for the country, so anything he has to do to stay in power, including extorting a foreign country for dirt on an opponent, is justified. It basically says that Donald Trump's personal interests are one and the same with America's interests. Or as Louis XIV said, l'état c'est moi, I am the state. But that isn't the language of a president in a democracy, it's the language of a king or a dictator. By the way, we have seen other Americans try to make this argument. It basically harkens back to the Nixonian defense of when the president does it, that means it's not illegal.
Well, when the president does it, that means that it is not illegal.
By definition.
Exactly.
And look, I'm not gonna waste any time on Richard Nixon's absurd defenses. We should probably focus on one criminal Republican president at a time, other than to say that this defense ultimately didn't end up working out too well for Nixon, did it? Now, to be clear, Dershowitz's argument is utterly insane. He's basically advocating on behalf of presidential lawlessness, that not only could Trump get away with this, but that he could do anything so long as he could claim that it's in his benefit, since he is, in effect, the state. But it shows just how low these Trump stooges are willing to go to defend him. That because they can't defend him on the merits, because they can't defend him on the law, they've resorted to arguing that the law simply doesn't apply to him, that he can do whatever he wants and get away with it. What's even more ironic is that Trump and his legal team have been screaming from the rooftops that he's simply trying to preserve the office for future presidents. Again, that he's selflessly not looking out for himself, but rather the next person to take office. Because if there's one thing we know about Donald Trump, it's his altruism. But arguing that any corrupt act the president makes in furtherance of his or her own re-election prospects is fine because ultimately the country benefits by having them in office would then make it impossible to ever impeach a president again in the future. It would, in actuality, destroy the office. It would insulate the president from ever being held accountable for corrupt activities because they could always simply fall back on the idea that them being there is in the public interest. Although clearly, it's not difficult to see why Trump would be drawn to this idea. And so what we've seen here, from the very beginning until now, are Republican arguments shifting from Trump didn't commit a quid pro quo all the way to Trump is allowed to do any quid pro quo he wants and he can't be held accountable for anything. If the goalposts were moved any farther back, they would be in the parking lot. And look, at the risk of sounding alarmist, Dershowitz's argument should scare anyone that has an interest in the United States remaining a democracy. It fuses the president with the state and gives him unlimited power to act in his own self-interest. It takes accountability away and places him squarely above the law, but that is not how we operate in the United States. I get that the GOP has devolved into a cult of personality and they've all hitched their political careers to Trump because, God forbid, they were ever on the receiving end of a mean tweet, but political cowardice and desperation to get reelected isn't an excuse to tear up the Constitution. So when you go to the polls in November, as you're casting your ballot, remember that one of the candidates is arguing in front of the entire nation that not only did he commit crimes, not only does he not regret it, but he should be able to do that and more with no consequences whatsoever.